just introduce you. So Dr. MacNamara holds board certifications in medical biochemistry, in internal medicine, and chemical pathology. And she has an eclectic experience of teaching and training programs that range from university to CJAB, CEOs to managers, patients to caregivers in a variety of settings from China to North America. Dr. MacNamara is particularly interested in optimal use of resources and pertinence in our healthcare system. And she's been head of the laboratories at the Jewish General Hospital for over 20 years. And in addition to her expertise in laboratory medicine, she has extensive experience in implementing computer systems throughout the healthcare network. And she's also currently attending on the palliative care ward, in addition to her other clinical laboratory and teaching responsibilities. Thanks, Elizabeth, for joining us, and I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much indeed. As I said, I'm really looking forward to today's. I enjoyed yesterday's so much that I was surprised. And I know that probably is a sort of a backhanded compliment, but I really was very, very surprised and very delighted with yesterday's. And when I looked at the two people I'm introducing today, I was thrilled, because this is true patient activism. And as you can see from my background knowledge, I am, as they would say, I am a fox and not a hedgehog. And today's topics are from two people who are genuinely foxes. And when you actually get to know them, you will realize it. So I was looking at Sharra Vostral. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
You're good.
So that she actually comes from Purdue in Indiana. And when you look at her, and I just was stunned. I said, here is somebody, and this is the line that I loved, was her research intersects history of medicine, science, technology, gender studies, using material culture as a basis to explore cultures, politics, power, and identity. If ever there was a fox, this is a fox. She looks right across everything. And I think it's not that we don't need the hedgehogs, we do, but we definitely need the foxes that actually amalgamate the whole thing together to make us look at it in ways that we wouldn't normally look at. She's going to talk about tampons, technology, and toxic shock. So I actually started medicine in the 80s. And I was there as we were all discovering toxic shock syndrome from tampons. And as a young woman, or young enough woman, I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified when the news came out. And so I'm really looking forward to your talk. I'll hand the floor over to you.
So menstruation and its management through technologies of tampons and menstrual pads serve as a useful case study about the relationship of patients and consumers. This is somewhat odd because in general, menstruation is a normal bodily process, not requiring medical intervention. So there are no patients to be seen or had. Additionally, its management only became successfully commodified in the early 20th century. So women consumers of menstrual products are a modern construct. Yet this frequent, normal, healthy, and common bodily function and fluid carry meaning disproportionate to earwax or sweat, for example. Menses has been identified as a biological marker of woman and womanhood and used as a rationale for limited political status based on Enlightenment and natural rights politics. Not only is menses a politicized bodily fluid, it has generally been considered a stigma, best neutralized with menstrual pads and tampons, which I describe in my first book as technologies of passing, to overcome social and political restrictions. Yet, despite this being a normal process and women purchasing seemingly benign absorbent materials, how did cultural ideas about menstruation affect women's identities as patients and consumers? And moreover, how did they end up in yet a third category of informant? This fraught process from consumer, which I would say is a compelled consumption because it's an effort to neutralize a stigma, to involuntary patient, which they didn't choose in the first place, to an obligated informant to the Centers for Disease Control is exemplified with this illness of tampon-related toxic shock syndrome. So in 1980, healthy women consumers first purchased super absorbent tampons and became patients suffering with a newly identified and named illness, and then became informants in the epidemiological studies for the Centers for Disease Control. So the terms of choice and consumerism are somewhat misleading because why would anyone knowingly choose TSS as an outcome of purchasing and using a tampon? I have made the claim that menstrual pads, referred to as sanitary pads in the past, and tampons that were categorized as feminine hygiene products should actually be considered technologies with their own histories of innovation, engineering, and patenting. They were manufactured and sold to women through the visual culture of elaborate advertising campaigns and magazines, which we talked a little bit about yesterday in other venues, and menstrual education programs for girls. Thus, menstruation became successfully commodified by the 1920s, creating a new group of consumers based on the purported premise that menstruation was dirty and the products transformed stigmatized women's bodies to clean and hygienic. Consuming menstrual management products also became a means to demonstrate modernity rather than being old-fashioned. It was a way to assert independence, claim bodily freedom, and toss away a soiled one-time use product. Women could relinquish the time-consuming duty of hand laundering and air drying reusable menstrual cloths and instead purchase a disposable item. However, disposable menstrual products are more than just commodities. They are technoscientific tools to manage menstruation, becoming a technological fix for a stigmatized bodily process to hide and contain a leaky body. Technoscience is a hallmark of biomedicalization, yet we generally do not associate technoscience with gendered technologies or stigmatized bodily processes. Thus, when innovations in material science and design during the 1970s changed the content of some tampons and they were marketed as super absorbent, many women happily purchased them as consumers, anxious to try the new and improved and keep masking their period and passing as if they were not menstruating. The intertwining of menstruation, medicalization, consumerism, and technology in 1980 created a different kind of patient through technological injury. Tampons, a tool of technoscientifically managing menses, became vectors of a deadly illness called toxic shock syndrome. Some women quickly transitioned from consumer to patient with trips to the doctor's office and emergency rooms, suffering from sepsis and fever. In 1980, the media alerted women to this new and frightening illness associated with menstrual products and tampon use. The illness raised grave concerns because it struck healthy individuals, and 70% of women use tampons. In addition to the early symptoms, they deceptively resembled the flu, which quickly deteriorated into septic shock and even death. The Centers for Disease Control conducted epidemiological studies and worked in conjunction with state and local health agencies. And these accidental and involuntary patients also doubled as obligated informants. The CDC sought to track outbreaks and identify cofactors of the illness. While the studies determined that all super absorbent tampons carried risk, the Rely tampon manufactured by Procter & Gamble demonstrated the highest rate of all. The company bore the brunt of the bad publicity and voluntarily withdrew Rely tampons from stores, sparing itself from a federal Food and Drug Administration recall. The informants, however, unwittingly took on a particularly vulnerable identity. While Procter & Gamble publicly received accolades for taking responsibility for its product and alerting women to the dangers of Rely, behind the scenes, it fought for access to the informants, to the women's data. Procter & Gamble pressured, challenged, and sued the Center for Disease Control for the right to identify informants and access their medical records. Procter & Gamble exerted strong commercial interest in seeking to retrieve the data that the CDC collected, presumably to discover epidemiological errors. The company proceeded to subpoena records with the CDC, which the CDC contested, and resulted in Farnsworth versus Procter & Gamble in 1985, which ultimately provided protection to the CDC data. However, it was the women and their intersecting identities of consumer, patient, and informant that swayed the appellate judges. It was not product liability as consumers or privacy as patients, but the right to be free of embarrassment as an informant that moved the court. The politics of respectability carried more weight than any of the prior identities. The CDC had experienced a crash course in managing and containing a unique health crisis related to tampon technology. I argue in my book that It was one of the first times that a technology was recognized as a cofactor in the production of an illness. As such, the Epidemic Intelligence Service, the EIS as it's called within the CDC, composed of expert voices of physicians and scientists. They were the media contacts for disseminating information to the public about tampon-related TSS and the risks of tampon use. And they did cooperate with all the tampon manufacturers to share data and exchange information and knowledge about the rapidly worsening condition that was sickening and killing mostly white young women. Thus, when Procter & Gamble requested the data from the studies, the CDC provided 34,000 pages and the documents related to their research with only names and addresses redacted. Procter & Gamble felt that this was not in the spirit of the freedom of information, and it hampered their ability to actually interview the women and conduct checks on CDC research. Jean Matthews, who was the chief legal advisor for the CDC from 1979 to 2004, recalled, "We were left on our own to deal with this trench warfare that went on for about 5 years." He and his legal team, composed of Karen Kaunitz, Verla Nesland, and Nancy Buck from the FDA, Nina Hunt, an assistant US Attorney General, rallied to defend the CDC from a subpoena filed by Procter & Gamble in 1981 for the epidemiological records to include names and addresses. As Matthews put it, that wasn't going to happen. We just weren't going to give in on that. They filed a protective order in 1982 to challenge the subpoena in US District Court, but this was new territory. This was a first, and as Matthews said, there was, quote, "no case that had ever been litigated like this where a company was wanting the names of women, the subjects, in an emergency outbreak public health investigation." At issue was the lack of a statutory basis to deny Procter & Gamble's request. There was a common sense argument that anonymity was necessary for good public health records and research, since private information was relayed to epidemiologists about sexual histories, douching, and menstrual cycles, as well as STIs. And they searched and eliminated variables related to the illness through those questions. The concern was that these responses had implications for shame, embarrassment, and impropriety, and the informants trusted that this information would be kept confidential. Matthews, though, took a proactive approach, and he created a questionnaire which he sent out to informants, explaining that Procter & Gamble was interested in talking to them about their TSS experience and would they want to be contacted by Procter & Gamble for such purposes. He received the following responses: 32 agreed to the disclosure, 119 denied and declined it, and 29 were just bad addresses or just he didn't receive anything back. This proved useful in court as it offered evidence of women's unwillingness to have their identities disclosed to Procter & Gamble. As Matthews put it, before you go to the mat on litigation, you've got to decide, can we afford to lose? This question took on extra importance because the illness HIV/AIDS had just emerged within the CDC lexicon of epidemics. Toxic shock syndrome provide a dress rehearsal for the EIS, the spokespersons, and the legal counsel about the demands that HIV/AIDS would levy, especially in terms of confidentiality of the informants about the virus. This, though, also provided Matthews some reassurance. He reasoned, quote, "We began to believe if we got a court opinion that ruled against us, we had a pretty good chance of going back to Congress and making a compelling argument that this, a legal statute, was needed. If you want us to be able to get valid information in order to protect the public from disease outbreaks like AIDS that was going on, they need a federal law." Although there were 4 separate oral arguments that the CDC legal team prepared for the purposes of this presentation, I will focus on the final case brought to the 11th Circuit US Court of Appeals in 1985, better known as Farnsworth versus Procter & Gamble. The appeal for Procter & Gamble hung on the issue of what is known as discovery. That is, the company had the right to discover the names of the informants of the CDC studies in order to verify or find errors in epidemiology. According to the court, the law's basic presumption is that the public is entitled to every person's evidence, and that the federal rules of civil procedure strongly favor full discovery whenever possible. With this logic, the CDC had provided no guarantee of anonymity, but made every effort to maintain confidentiality. In part, Matthew's efforts of outreach and his little mini survey about women's desire for confidentiality provided significant to the court. It demonstrated the CDC's good faith effort to work with the company and even deliver about 30 women who would talk to Procter & Gamble. The court discerned that, quote, Procter & Gamble has the identity of at least 50 women involved in the study. They have apparently cooperated with Procter & Gamble, and biases of the study participants may well be discovered from questioning these women. In addition, with balancing the assumption of privacy, the court was not inclined to favor on Procter & Gamble's behalf. Matthews described one moment in the oral argument when Larry Elliman, one of the Procter & Gamble lawyers, tried to explain to the panel of all male judges why they wanted to contact the women to, quote, just ask them questions to see if this is right. As Matthews put it, he recalled one of the judges roused up, leaned forward, glared down and said, haven't the women already said they don't want to talk to you? Matthews continued, I was feeling a little bit better that day. We won, and we won big. Procter & Gamble pursued the matter no further in higher court. The win included a validation of the CDC's work and ability to operate within an ethic of guaranteeing anonymity. The court determined, quote, first, the center's purpose is the protection of public health. Central to this purpose is the ability to conduct probing scientific and social research supported by a population willing to submit to in-depth questioning. Undisputed testimony in the record indicates that disclosure of the names and addresses of the research participants could seriously damage this voluntary reporting. Even without an express guarantee of confidentiality, there is an expectation, not unjustified, that when highly personal and potentially embarrassing information is given for the sake of medical research, it will remain private. End of quote from the court. Though we are now accustomed to institutional review board oversight, it was only 1974 that the National Research Act established IRBs to review medical and behavioral research. The lawyers at the CDC were very much at the forefront of establishing protocol about informants. This was an important victory for the CDC, noted by William Curran, a legal specialist in health law who had a long-running notes section on medical intelligence in the New England Journal of Medicine. He interpreted the case for more directly for practitioners and concluded that in one important aspect, the CDC has achieved a very important victory for all researchers who ensure the confidentiality of personal identity in voluntary epidemiologic studies that are conducted in the interest of the public's health. But he had a far more startling assessment and interpreted through a feminist lens as more troublesome. Curran surmised that, quote, the court in fact asserted at the end of its opinion that its decision did not depend on any legal privilege, meaning that the court was not relying on any other legal ethical privilege of professional confidentiality to protect the names and addresses of the subjects of the study, unquote. As Curran put it, the women were not patients to whom an obligation of confidentiality is traditionally owed by physicians. They were merely, quote, revealing information about their personal lives and experiences to an investigator in a federal agency. Thus, if women in the study were not patients, all the usual professional agreements about the Hippocratic Oath, Nuremberg Code, AMA Code of Ethics, etc., did not technically apply. The ruling actually protected the CDC and its ability to carry out the business of public health, but not a woman's right to her individual right to her bodily privacy. So the technological injury of tampon-related TSS precipitated a shift in identity for some women from consumer to patient to informant, with differing and lessening degrees of protection. An assumption of confidentiality was at the core of trust developed between the women who contracted TSS and the epidemiologists who interviewed them, but in a system constantly challenged by commercial and outside interests that did not necessarily hold individuals' rights as a core value, the CDC resorted to court proceedings to secure a right to anonymity. However, this right is still quite tenuous because it relies on basically white women's respectability and the perceived need to protect them from embarrassment, including shame related to questions about sexual partners, STIs, and menstruation. This focused examination of TSS demonstrates the medical, legal, and social understandings and privileges of the categories of consumer, patient, and informant, and the consequences they have on our collective health. And it points to the question, should health data and privacy perhaps be considered personal property, which would afford broader rights of protection as we move to Lawrence Rosenberg's projection of the individual as a corporation interacting with the medical system. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I've actually learned an awful lot. So while I'm waiting for questions to come up, do you know if, I mean, because I really didn't understand, ever heard of any of this before, which I am very grateful for you telling me. Do you know if it exists in other countries? Like, do you know if Canada has a similar, or Europe?
Similar,
like protection of anybody who's actually giving information to the CDC or an equivalent. Like if it was Procter & Gamble in Europe, would they have been able to get that information, or do you know?
I don't know. I'm sure they went after it. I mean, anywhere they were selling tampons, they were trying to figure out how to reach women who were ill. And I don't know the particulars of Canada. I'm sorry about that. I do know that they were quite ruthless in going after women's information. People would call into the company and say, I feel sick, or my daughter fell ill, and they would get, they would get the name of the parent or the location. And I have one incident where they actually went and talked to the pharmacist at one of the local Kmarts in town to interview the pharmacist in order to get information about who the physician was. And so they were really using all these back doors to get information. But I don't know what the status of patient protection is in Canada, and maybe someone else can help me with that. I'm sorry to say.
I was very shocked. I was very shocked by what you said, because this was all new, and it really is shocking that a company would actually have such a right. It's frightening to me.
Yeah, it's this moment too of shareholder, what do they call it? Basically, the shareholder is the prime sort of important the prime community of the corporation. So it's not, even the consumers, it's the shareholder that the company is providing wealth to. So you protect the shareholders' rights, and the shareholders need for you to sue the government in order to protect your product. So it's a very odd logic, but it spins out in all of these cases, which I think is why it's just fascinating to trace the stigmatized object, because it reveals a lot about the law system and how rights and privileges are being configured at this moment. And we still kind of are stuck with some of them and the problematic ways they're constructed.
And I think you're linking it to Dr. Rosenberg. Is what he was saying is like, to use us and use these things against us is shocking. So I've got a question here.
I just typed it out because I didn't think it was a big question, but I was thinking about the Dalkon Shield and IUDs, and it's a case that's not that much earlier, and I think it involved some cases of sepsis, and I was just wondering how much you know about that case. I can't recall much about it, and if there are any if there are any parallels there in terms of the treatment or outcome of the case.
Well, I think the parallels in general are about technological injury, and not, well, with the Dalkon Shield, it was more not relaying the dangers and the risks and covering up what the company knew. So there were definitely problems with wicking, with the thread that hung out. A lot of people became infertile after they used it. So it was a pretty serious, there was pretty serious and damaging technological injury to it. So I put tampons in there with that as something that the effects and outcomes are diminished and minimized. And so that the TSS, I think, is a little different because of the death component and the speed, because it was healthy women who would quickly go into, within 24 to 72 hours, really go into a very grisly death. And it's white women too. So I think there's some paternalism happening. There's some rescue happening of white women who are supposed to be the future mothers of society, and that kind of messiness of civilization that's back to the 19th century. So I think that's what made TSS a little bit different, because it wasn't injury to the uterus or fertility with like the Dalkon shield. It was a whole bodily process that could create death. And I can go into a lot more detail about how that happens. But anyway, I think those are maybe some of the differences between the two. And Dalkon shield did get shut down, obviously, but we still have tampons. So that's where there's the difference as well. Like, how do we still manage to live with this technology?
Although people are moving to the cups now, which are cheaper. Charlotte?
I believe Gracia says she's unmuted now, and she can go before me.
Okay, Gracia.
Oh, thanks. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, great. More than a question, was just curiosity. I was wondering if there was any reverberation, any consequence of this, let's call it scandal of the toxic shock syndrome in Europe as well. Because there's a label on tampons here too about the toxic shock syndrome, and so I was curious I don't know if you know more about this, about what happened in Europe.
Yeah, the super absorbents really took hold in the 1970s, early 1980s, and it was synthetic materials that helped to create Rely as a super absorbent. And so the marketing was in the United States, but I know there were plans for Japan and Canada and parts of Europe. Because obviously Procter & Gamble is a global corporation. So the idea was to just keep spreading out. So in some ways, the other countries were spared at least that particular tampon, because it hadn't kind of hadn't colonized everywhere yet. Procter & Gamble hadn't gotten the tampons out around the world, but super absorbents are produced by other companies. And so it's not that anyone is spared from it, but it's also, I've been watching little pockets of TSS even recently. It seems to happen in northern more climates. So there's some pockets that have popped up in England, parts of Minnesota in the United States. So I think there's some bacteriological stuff going on, and then also the tampon itself with a super absorbency. And if people are less swayed to purchase super absorbents, then that diminishes the probability of it. But it still is a thing. It's very much a thing. It hasn't gone away. People, it's still something that people can contract.
So Charlotte, we've got about 5, maybe 8 minutes to go, and we've got 3 questions.
I'll try to be quick. Thank you very much for the presentation. As you were speaking, what I was wondering is, a big component of this, I think, as you've mentioned, seems to be a bit of paternalism and control over women's bodies and women's information. And I wonder how likely is it that this would have happened had it been Viagra or Rogaine that had been causing these kinds of issues. So I'm wondering, are there any case examples of medical technologies affecting men specifically, which led to similar legal battles?
I don't know of any. That doesn't mean they don't exist. This one is just such a unique circumstance because it's a technology warrant internally. And I think it does have sort of, it's a forewarning for other technologies that we do embed into our bodies. I know I've talked to many physicians about implants, knee replacements, things like that, and just how careful you have to be to make sure bacteria doesn't get into all those little crevices and, kind of hide away as a stowaway. And I think that is the interesting component of this particular technology as well, because it's the technology and the bacterium together. And I call it a biocatalytic technology that precipitates a different kind of illness. And the more we're talking about implants, I think the more we have to think about bacterium as biological users of the technology. And we're not really to that point to think about our microbiome as a co-constituent with us as a human being. I mean, there's people who are even calling us human homo microbis is one of the terms, which is a different way of thinking about what it means to be human. So no, I don't know what exact technology that is for men in the past, but I think it has, it's sort of a warning really about what can come in the future if we don't really take this pretty seriously.
Okay, so Vivian?
Yes, thank you. So as I was thinking about just the contrast of this story with Antoine's story yesterday about the side effects of SSRIs and just the very different corporate reaction, which was we did all this testing and just sort of denial. And here we have instead, I guess, just such uncontestable, evidence of harm. And it made me just wonder, and perhaps I missed this at the beginning of your talk, about what kind of evidence and testing the Procter & Gamble did. Like, I guess just a question of why this was such a surprise.
Yeah, I mean, and I think like Antoine was saying, there is testing that happens, but because of the sample size, it doesn't catch all of the potential problems. And with TSS, it's, between like 1 and 3 out of 100,000 people. So, in that test sample, it's not obvious if you're going to have that person who's already predisposed sort of to experience TSS. So that's part of it. The other part is the testing is different with medical devices. It's not the same as pharmaceuticals. And, in the States, there's the Medical Device Amendment that was passed in 1976, but there's a lot of what is called the grandfathering in of technologies. So, since tampons were around since the 1930s, it was just assumed that they're safe. You don't need to show that they're different. And so they're just, they sort of can bypass that regulatory process. And they did test for things at Procter & Gamble, like if it was carcinogenic or if it caused birth defects. But also, if you're not looking for a new illness, if you don't know there's a new illness, you're not looking for it either. So the unknown unknowns are pretty high in this particular case. But also, I think because it is this throwaway, disposable, stigmatized thing, it's also very much sort of pushed to the side as it being insignificant for the problems that it may create. So I think it's all of that working together to minimize the results of the testing, because they did test, but whether or not the testing meant anything is another question.
Thank you very much. And I agree with what you're saying. Like, even if you look at the vaccine, they didn't, the anaphylactic reactions and things didn't come out until they opened it up to millions of people. Mm-hmm. Samir?
Yes, thank you, Sharra. Lovely book, lovely piece of research, and I look forward to reading your book. So I want to piggyback on the comments by Vivian about the testing and how, because I have a story to share related to that same company and how they tried, I believe it was the late 80s, to introduce high absorption materials in baby diapers. Mm-hmm. And I knew I had a colleague who worked on the testing basically in the field for side effects ahead of marketing. And the field trial was done in a poor Latin American country literally in a shanty town where people were paid to have their children wear the diapers. And so the research team would come and visit to measure rashes and skin effects. And then everything looked very good. And then one day, that researcher I knew went in there without forewarning and recognized some of the kids that were part of the study running around without diapers. And after a severe questioning, they learned that basically the children would put the diapers on for the team visit, and then during the off time they would run around, naked, the way nature meant it to be. So, but that did not stop the study, and those new versions of Pampers did make it to the market. So I think those kind of stories continue to this day.
Yeah, and the particular absorbent material that some of those diapers incorporated was called carboxymethylcellulose, which is the same synthetic component that was used in Rely tampons. So through chemistry, through material science, there were these super absorbent materials that they were looking for markets and applications to use the super absorbents. And so diapers are a prime example of a place to do that. And so actually they were concerned with TSS, even with young little kids as well. So that's that I did see that in some of the records, but I didn't know about that particular case study. Yeah.
Well, thank you. It was a great talk, and really I enjoyed the discussion. I am so impressed with how much I'm learning here. Thank you again.